What is going on, everybody? Thank you for tuning in to another edition of the Touchline Talk Show. This week, all about season previews. We did Bundesliga, La Liga last week, saving the other three leagues for this week. So that is what we're going to do. We're going to do Premier League first, a little bit of an extended preview all by itself, and then we will get into Ligue 1 and Serie A, as we are now days, but really hours away from the start of some of these leagues. Some of them don't start for another week, but you've got all kinds of different things going on, whether it's your first round of cups in Italy or, Community Shield. Now the Premier League is getting ready to go. Bundesliga has already had some German Cup games. So these teams are getting very, very, very close, which means it is time to finish our season preview series. Like I said, we're going to start with the Premier League and do a little bit of an extended preview here. Same basic format, but we added some other categories to really dive in. Because this is the most interesting league, it's the deepest league, there's the most to talk about in my opinion, and it's the biggest league in the world. So we're going to spend a little bit more time on it, and then we'll get to the other two. So an abbreviated recap of some of the biggest developments over the summer. I've already talked a lot about these, from Holland to Darwin Nunez to Raheem Sterling. So I want to focus specifically on some of the recent ones and some of the bigger trends. And then we're also going to get into a little bit of that later. So I'm trying not to touch too much on everything. But three recent moves I do want to talk about that we have not discussed on the show yet. First is Alexander Zinchenko going from Manchester City to Arsenal. He was very good and incredibly reliable for Manchester City as sort of the backup left back. Never got the opportunity to play in midfield, which if you watch him internationally with Ukraine, that is kind of where he's found his home. And he is a real weapon in midfield, to the point where I would argue he looks better as a midfielder than a left back, as good as he has been. And you see the attacking ability, but it's more combinations and just sort of midfield things to me than it is crosses and sort of what you would associate with a Trent Alexander-Arnold or Andy Robertson, for example. So I love this for Arsenal, A, because he's a really good player entering his prime, but B, because he fits from a squad standpoint so perfectly with what Arsenal are doing. Kieran Tierney is going to be your left back. However, Kieran Tierney has a history of getting injured. So now you have somebody who has proven he can play that position at the very highest level with Manchester City. But assuming Tierney stays healthy, you slot him into the midfield. Or at least it gives Mikel Arteta that option to have, as you're sort of balancing all of your different responsibilities, being back in Europe, injuries, things are going to happen. I would not be shocked if he starts 30, 35 games, most of them in midfield. And from Zinchenko's standpoint, this is an opportunity. He can clearly play at this level. But this gives him an opportunity to finally lock down a starting spot. It was just never going to happen at Manchester City for him. João Cancelo is the best left back in the world. That midfield is always stacked, and there are always going to be reinforcements coming. So he gives Arsenal something incredibly valuable, and they're providing him with a really valuable opportunity to take that next step in his career and become a regular starter and key piece for a team with Champions League aspirations. He is that good. I love this move. The other two, this one is flying under the radar, and it might end up not being significant at all. But Everton got Dwight McNeil from Burnley, and I want to talk about it for a second. Last season was awful. Burnley were awful last season. We're just going to throw that away. The seasons before that, though, you saw these flashes of just incredible skill from McNeil, to the point where he stood out for me. And it takes a lot to stand out in a Sean Dyche system. And then he gets to Everton, comes on in the preseason game, and is brilliant and does sort of the exact same thing he did for me playing earlier for Burnley, where he starts catching everybody's attention. I'm not saying he's going to all of a sudden become one of the best players in the Premier League. But for a team that has now lost Dominic Calvert-Lewin, at least for a little bit, lost Richarlison, didn't score enough goals anyway, this idea of kind of where is this production going to come from to make sure Everton doesn't get themselves in another relegation battle. Dwight McNeil, if it all comes together and it all clicks and he just needs a change of scenery, could absolutely be a huge difference maker for this team. Again, I'm not convinced this is going to happen. I'm not going to put my name behind Dwight McNeil having 10 goals and 10 assists this season. But I fully expect he's going to have a couple breathtaking moments, at least. And somebody's got to pick up the slack from Richarlison. Dominic Calvert-Lewin being healthy is going to help with that. But you need more than just him. I'm looking at Dwight McNeil to really be somebody who catches people's eyes this season and changes the way he is viewed within the Premier League. I will go that far. The final one, Gianluca Scamacca going to West Ham. He just scored 16 Serie A goals for Sassuolo. From the West Ham perspective, you need somebody to spell / support / provide an upgrade over Mikel Antonio. He was fine last season, but there is another level you're hoping to get to at the striker position if West Ham is going to take that next step. But on a more basic level, somebody needs to be able to play that position that's not named Mikel Antonio. He has been carrying this team and the attack for so long. And Jared Bowen was easily the most valuable player on this team last season and the most important player in the attack. But just as West Ham has progressed, Mikel Antonio has been doing so much heavy lifting. You need somebody to play that position, even if it's just to make sure he doesn't have to play every FA Cup game and every Europa Conference League game, along with every Premier League game. And now you've got somebody in Scamacca who could become a real difference maker and somebody that could actually elevate this team to the next level. That's exciting. I would like to point out the last time West Ham tried something like this, it didn't go so well. It didn't go so well because the striker involved, as we have learned, really struggled in more of the direct defense-first system and is much more comfortable playing in a possession-oriented front-foot team. Where does Scamacca come from? A team that just had the 5th most possession and 5th most shot creating actions in Serie A. I'm not saying this is the second coming of Sebastian Haller. I just want to actually see this work before I look at Scamacca as the reason West Ham is going to get 4th, 5th, 6th, pushing for a Champions League spot rather than sort of the 6-7 range they've been in. He could be the guy that takes them, like I said, to that next level, the next step in their development. I want to see how this works first because it's going to be a tactical, systematic adjustment for him. Okay, second thing. I just want to take a moment to talk about the center backs that have entered this league. I'm just going to run through some of the more notable transfers involving center backs. Diego Carlos has been so good for Sevilla, now at Aston Villa. Love that signing. Ben Mee joining Brentford. Big fan of that one too. Kalidou Koulibaly, of course, going from Napoli to Chelsea. He's been one of the top 3 defenders in the world for the past 3, 4, 5 seasons. Yes, a little bit, starting to enter out of his prime, but he's not out of his prime yet. He is easily the most underappreciated defender in the world. James Tarkowski going from Burnley to Everton. Certainly can't hurt to improve that center back situation after some of the mistakes we've seen the past couple of years. To be determined how much of a difference he makes. It's not exactly a needle mover, but it's a nice reinforcement. Lisandro Martinez, Ajax to Manchester United. He follows Erik ten Hag. I like the idea of Ten Hag getting somebody in who is very comfortable playing the way he wants to. The center backs Manchester United have, not exactly the most, forward-thinking, offensively gifted. Lisandro Martinez gives you something completely different. And number two, just from a body and backup standpoint, Harry Maguire had a rough year. Victor Lindelof just never really convinces you he's a lockdown starter for a team that's supposed to be competing for Champions Leagues and Premier League titles. Either you play Martinez with Maguire, or if Maguire just needs to kind of reset a little bit, you've got that covered now. I'm really curious to see exactly what role Martinez plays, but this makes a lot of sense. I'm not too worried about the fact that Ten Hag has went and got a lot of guys from the Eredivisie. You got to give him full reign to do whatever he feels is necessary to overhaul that team. And that starts with getting players who understand what he expects and buy into what he is trying to do from a cultural standpoint. This thing has got to turn 180 degrees in terms of the mentality surrounding this team. Getting guys who had this success at Ajax can't hurt that at all, and hopefully it helps. Sven Botman, Newcastle's big signing, comes in from Lille. And then the last one, Naif Algaard, going from Rennes to West Ham. All these teams, massive investments at the center back position. It's just really interesting to me. You don't usually see this. But some of your bigger signings of the year, outside of your Hollands and your Diego Carloses, have been at the center back position, so I wanted to run through those. And then finally, the one team I want to highlight that we haven't really gotten to talk about, and from a transfer changing the team standpoint, takes the cake when it comes to the Premier League, Nottingham Forest. We talked about this before, but Taiwo Awoniyi coming in from Union Berlin, really good season in the Bundesliga. You have Nico Williams, Jesse Lingard, Dean Henderson, all have Premier League experience. Jesse Lingard is going to be one of the most interesting players in the Premier League this season. Can he replicate what he did on loan at West Ham? If he can, this is going to get real interesting for Nottingham Forest. And the other part of this that's not getting enough attention, Harry Toffolo and Lewis O'Brien from Huddersfield. I know they're championship players. They were two of the very best in the championship last season. Maybe they don't play game in and game out, but I really, really, really impressed with both of them. Love what they can bring. And so Nottingham Forest has kind of done this every way possible. You brought in a big-time striker from a different league. You brought in some big names with Premier League experience, and you went and bought some of the best players from the championship to boost the group you're already bringing. I don't know if this is going to work. But if you're a Nottingham Forest fan, you have to be thrilled with the effort that is being put forward. They are not messing around. Go look at how much money they are paying Jesse Lingard. This is not a, we're happy to be here and we'll see what happens situation. They are trying to spend the money to make this last. They deserve credit for that. And the other part is they needed so many bodies because they had pivotal players that were on loan that they couldn't keep. And so part of this was there was naturally going to be a lot of turnover. But they didn't just replace. They upgraded. So I wanted to really dive into Nottingham Forest for a second there as well. Okay, so before we get to our storylines, wanted to sort of take three different segments and categorize some teams based on them. First, simply being title contenders. How many teams can actually compete for the Premier League title this season? My answer is three. Of course, Manchester City, Liverpool, and I'm throwing Spurs in there. And I'm not throwing Spurs in there half-heartedly. Do I think they're going to do it? No. They probably finish at least 6 points behind second place. But it's worth pointing out. Son, Kane, De Jong, Kulusevski. Best attacking trio in the world at the end of last season. I mean, Kulusevski was the fourth most productive player from a goals plus assists per 90 minutes standpoint in the Premier League last season, ahead of both Kane and Son. And that was him coming off of not doing very much at Juventus and joining a new league and a new team in a new country. If he can come close to replicating what he did last season, that is absolutely terrifying, and that's not even to mention the other additions they brought in with Richarlison, Ivan Perisic. You go down the line. I have all the faith in the world in Antonio Conte. I've said this before, I'll say it again. He is one of the very few managers who can actually come in and change the culture, the vibe of a team. Change the narrative surrounding a team. He has already done it at Tottenham. He got the money from Daniel Levy. They're a clear number 3. But based on tiers, I am putting them in tier 1 title contender, not top 4 hopeful. Okay, so then we're just going to throw all the European spots in there together. We're going to talk more about top 4 in a little bit here. But teams with a legitimate shot at qualifying for a European competition, be it the Champions League, the Europa League, Conference League. Obviously, you have your big 6. The 3 teams I am absolutely unequivocally throwing in there are West Ham, Leicester, and Newcastle. Obviously, West Ham just did. Leicester was competing in Europe last season. And Newcastle, again, we're going to spend more time on some of these teams, so I'm not going to go too deep here. But they played like a top 4 team in the second half of last season. I'm the biggest Eddie Howe fan you can find. Absolutely, they are a contender. Not saying they're going to go compete for the Champions League, but when you are looking at European spots, we are talking about at least 9 teams. And then finally, can't do a season preview without talking about relegation candidates. This list is fairly extensive for me as well. Fulham, Nottingham Forest, Bournemouth. You're automatically on the list if you just came up, unless you do something incredible in the transfer window or have some kind of extenuating circumstance. These teams don't. I love what Forest have done. I don't think Forest are going to get relegated, but they're absolutely a relegation candidate. Then I'm throwing in Leeds, just because if it all goes terribly and Patrick Bamford doesn't stay healthy, we saw how bad it looked last year. Again, I don't think they're going down, but they have to be part of the conversation. The other 3 teams I'm throwing in there. Southampton, very quietly, were horrendous to end last season. It's been a steady downward decline. If a team is going to sort of get dragged into that race we're not expecting, that's my pick. And then I'm also Everton. Until you prove that's not who you are, you're in this category. Simple as that. Final team I'm throwing in here is Brentford. This might be the most remarkable stat I've come across in all the preparation I have done for this season. Christian Eriksen played 11 Premier League games for Brentford last season. In those 11 games, Brentford accumulated 22 points. They had 46 all season. They were a top 4 team with him, albeit a very small sample size. And a team that would have gotten relegated without him. That is how this breaks down if you look at what they were doing from a points perspective with him and what they were doing without. He is no longer there, therefore, they are a absolute relegation candidate, and we have seen this before. These teams that have that really good, promising first season often come back down to earth and sort of crash and burn year two. Happened to Huddersfield, happened to Sheffield United, nearly happened to Leeds last season. Would not be surprised at all if Brentford is next on that list. Okay, so here are actual storylines. I'm just throwing this in as the top four. A couple different things I want to point out and discuss here. 1. Can Spurs actually lock up third? I will be unapologetic in my belief. They should. I also believe they will, but they need to actually do it. Because all of a sudden it gets a little more interesting if you're talking about 2 Champions League spots up for grab rather than 1. Number 2, we'll stay in North London. Can Arsenal close the deal this time? They were right there for most of last season, and then it all fell apart because they hadn't been there before, and Spurs had, and Antonio Conte came in. Can Manchester United even come close to those 2 teams I just mentioned? Because I'm looking at the big 6, and to me, it is very clear what the order is. You can go back and forth between Liverpool and Manchester City 1-2. But then it's Spurs, it's Arsenal, it's Chelsea, and it's United. And then for Chelsea, what does this era look like? Can they hold on to a Champions League spot? Does Thomas Tuchel survive? There's just a lot going on there right now. And of course, the other question with this is, can anybody touch these 6 teams and get themselves into this conversation? But that's really more my second point here, which is this, right? Every year, it's a question of, can anybody break the top 6? Can anybody finish above these big 6? And if so, who is it? You've got an inexperienced Arsenal team, a United that I will just not believe is going to finish in a Champions League spot consistently until they prove otherwise. It happens year after year after year. I'm not going to expect a different result until something actually changes. And you got Chelsea with a lot of question marks. We talked about West Ham earlier. There is a world. They're a little bit deeper. You get a little more production from the striker position. Thomas Souček's goal tally got cut in half last year. They're playing in the Conference League, not the Europa League. So ideally, you're able to rotate a little bit more in the group stage. There's a world in which West Ham absolutely gets here. That's not anything too extraordinary. I mean, they very, very nearly did it last season. And I think I like their chances better this year. As of right now, Leicester's midfield is still James Maddison, Yuri Tielemans, and Wilfred Ndidi. That midfield plus Jamie Vardy get you into this conversation. Full stop. They still finished 8th last year and were bad and hurt. And James Maddison was ridiculously good at the end of the season. They're in that conversation. You know who was 6th in expected goal difference? Crystal Palace. Crystal Palace tied for the most draws in the league. That was a weird sentence. With 15. We're having a very different conversation about Crystal Palace if they win 2 or 3 more of those games. You know who finished right behind Crystal Palace in the expected goals difference table? The other team that tied for the most draws in the league, Brighton. Here's the case for Brighton. First of all, the explanation for how they went from where they were 2 seasons ago to where they were last season is very simple. They actually became somewhat decent at finishing. That was just horrifically bad in front of goal. 2 seasons ago. I mean, the XG compared to the amount of goals they scored was bonkers. If they can take their ability to implement a style of play and control games and just go from being okay at finishing and okay at creating chances to good at creating chances and taking them, they could really be a factor in this conversation. I believe that much in Graham Potter. The question is, do they actually have the talent to do it? Because some of the reason they have been so poor finishing is they're just talent-wise not at the same level as the other teams creating those opportunities. Sometimes it's not unlucky. Sometimes it's just you didn't execute. And when it happens time and time again, all that tells me is this is an execution talent problem that hasn't really gone away, but it got much better last season. Can Graham Potter get a little bit more out of this group? Then, of course, there's Newcastle, who were a top 4 team for the final 5 or so months of the season. Eddie Howe turned Joe Linton into their player of the season as a midfielder. The core of this team is still the same group that was there before the takeover. However, Bruno Guimaraes changes the equation and is why, I'm buying what they did at the end of last season. The question is, what does that actually mean? Does that mean they're a team that can compete for 7th, 6th, 5th? Or does that mean they are legitimately in the conversation for being one of the best 4 teams in the league? Regardless, it's not hard to justify why they could break into the top 6 and be part of this conversation. The other team I will throw in here, with some hesitation, is Wolves, because they conceded the fewest goals outside the top 4. Now, that might be the luckiest defensive season I have ever seen, based on the amount of goals they were expected to give up. The attack was dreadful. But if Raul Jimenez finds himself again, Adama Traore takes a massive leap and becomes consistent, and they figure things out defensively, it's not out of the realm of possibility they become part of this conversation too. And finally, this is one of the most interesting parts of this season I don't think is getting talked enough about. What happens when all of these players who made a huge impact at the end of last season actually get a preseason and 38 games? 3 in particular. The first, I already talked about him, Christian Eriksen. He was that important to Brentford. What kind of difference can he make at Manchester United? Can he find a way to play with Bruno Fernandes? Does he just kind of replace Paul Pogba? Is that a real upgrade? What does he look like at this point without being the focal point of a team? Because his role within Manchester United's system is going to be very different than Brentford building an attack around him. And on the flip side, what are Brentford without Christian Eriksen? Was that those splits that I talked about earlier, based on when he played and when he didn't, a sign of things to come? Or was that an aberration? And of course they were better with him, but they were still 15th, 14th best team when he wasn't on the field. There are 2 different aspects of this that are fascinating to me. Second one, Felipe Coutinho. Once Aston Villa got Coutinho, they beat everybody they should, generally speaking, and just stayed where they were in the table. They basically accumulated the same amount of points with him as they did without him. He played half the season. There wasn't a huge gap or statistically a way to kind of say, hey, here's this massive impact he's making. But that was, again, him coming back a half season, hadn't been a focal point in the team for a while. This is an Aston Villa team that is slowly but steadily improving, as Steven Gerrard tends to do with teams he manages, and is trying to break through. Coutinho is going to be a big reason why if they do. So what does he look like with a full season? Are they actually significantly better? It's a no-brainer to keep him because you got him for so cheap because Barcelona wanted to get his wages off their massive wage bill. But does he... It's sort of the opposite of the Eriksen question. Does he really make that much of a difference to where now, with a full season of Philippe Coutinho, Aston Villa are in that conversation with your Crystal Palaces, your Brightons, your Newcastles, your Leicesters, trying to compete with West Ham to be that next team outside the Big Six? Or are they just the 12th best team in the league? He's going to give you some good moments, and he's a nice player to have. And then finally, Bruno Guimaraes. Mentioned him as well. What is Newcastle's ceiling with him? There was so much going on that it was hard to separate the variables last season, right? Because you had Howe and Guimaraes coming in. You had the ownership change. Maybe they just started playing better. It's impossible to pinpoint exactly what happened. And of course, it's a combination of all of these. But how much weight are you supposed to put on Howe's coaching versus Guimaraes' arrival? That's what we're going to start to learn a little bit more about this season. He was spectacular. They were excellent with him. As I said before when I was talking about him, what does that actually mean? How far can they go this season? Are they going from 11th to 7th, 8th, somewhere in there? Or are they going from 11th to right up there, 4, 5, 6, going toe-to-toe with the Arsenals and Manchester Uniteds of the world? Okay, that was a lot. There is the Premier League season preview for an in-depth breakdown of all 20 teams, including 3 headlines for each, X Factor for each, all of that good stuff. Head to my Substack, touchlinetalk.substack.com. The first 10 teams in alphabetical order is already out. The second one is coming soon, so be on the lookout for that. We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be back to talk Ligue 1 and Serie A. And welcome back to the Touchline Talk Show. We are going to jump right in here with the Serie A season preview. First, got to recap the summer biggest developments during the transfer window. Notable arrivals outside of, Romelu Lukaku. We've already talked about that. Charles de la Ketelara has moved from Club Brugge to AC Milan. It's a fun name to say. De Ketelara, I believe is how you pronounce it. Did some research earlier today. Attacking midfielder, really good creative player. Plenty of the bigger teams in Europe wanted him. AC Milan gets his signature. Juventus, reloading to a certain extent. Bremer comes across from Torino, one of the best defenders in the league last season, to replace Matthias de Ligt. Paul Pogba, of course, joins Angel Di Maria. Paul Dybala is out the door. this is basically, I mean, for the most part, just kind of replacing one guy with another. You got the center backs in, Dybala leaves, Pogba comes in, Di Maria will give you something. But these names are huge. There's plenty of turnover there, so they are going to be one of the most interesting teams. They're also, of course, just Juventus, so they're naturally interesting. But a lot of changes at Juve this summer. And then Roma, coming off of a very solid end of last season. Paulo Dybala, probably saw the pictures. If not, check them out. His unveiling was otherworldly. And Nemanja Matic comes as well. Again, both free transfers, so good pieces of business for Roma there. Other team I wanted to mention real quickly in terms of rivals, Atalanta has gone and just started picking away from other Serie A teams. Jeremy Boga, Ederson, Mira Demiral, all coming from inside the league as Atalanta tries to rebound from a really difficult season. Departures-wise, Napoli, the list is longer than this, but your most notable departees, of course, Kalidou Koulibaly going to Chelsea, Lorenzo Insigne's in Toronto, Dries Mertens has left the club, as has David Ospina. Those are four guys who have been vital to sort of the identity of this Napoli team over the past 5 to 10 years. This is very much turning the page into a new era for Napoli. We'll see how things go. That's an awful lot of talent that walked out the door. Sassuolo lose two promising players that we've already talked about. One of them, Jeremy Boga, going to Atalanta. And again, this is also the club that Gianluca Scamacca came from for West Ham. Really fun team to watch, Sassuolo. Going to have to rebuild a little bit in attack, but we are going to talk about them a little bit later for a specific reason. And then the other notable departure I wanted to mention, Noel Molina, right back going to Atletico Madrid from Udinese. So that's kind of your mid-table guy you may not have heard of who's now at a big club getting that big move. Those are the most prominent moves I wanted to highlight to sort of set the scene for our storylines. The first storyline, very simply, the dominance of the two Milan teams. Does it continue? Does anybody come close to touching them? Can Juventus actually get back into this equation? Or are we going to go Inter versus AC Milan for the third year in a row? And then also the second part of this, I talked about this after AC Milan won the league, but what is the gap between these two teams? Are we going to get a toe-to-toe race? Because they've gone back and forth the past two seasons, but it kind of sputtered in the final weeks of the season where you knew what direction this thing was headed. Now you have the champion AC Milan team, albeit one that lost Frank Kessié, and a Romelu Lukaku Inter team. Which in my head means they are almost dead even. AC Milan improved last season. Inter took a step back. Inter add Lukaku, which puts them right back in there. So it's sort of twofold here. Of, are we doing this again? And are we going to get an even tighter race than the last two seasons, which have been exciting? They just haven't gone down to the very last, game where you don't know what is going to happen. And of course, we don't get those very often. So you got to treasure every single one that you do get, like we saw in the Premier League last season, and like I think we very well could get in Serie A this year. Second headline. If you're going to assume the two Milan teams are in the top three, and Juventus is also in the top three, you got that fourth spot. And this is where things get really interesting for me. This was Napoli. And then we just went through all of the players Napoli has lost. They're not going to fall off the face of the earth. And they do have some wiggle room because they were part of that title race for a good portion of last season. Clearly the third best team in the league. But do they even have enough now to stay and hold on to fourth? And you start looking at some of the teams that are going to be knocking on their door. Roma are just all the good vibes right now, coming off of the Conference League title. Already got Dybala in. Apparently, they're close to landing both Andrea Bellotti and Gigi Wijnaldum. We'll see if those moves come to fruition. But all of a sudden, it's a team with a proven goal scorer in Tammy Abraham, plenty of talent around him, and Jose Mourinho. If I have to pick, they're the team finishing fourth right now. The other two teams I wanted to highlight. Lazio are always around. Usually they're sort of on the short end of the stick when it comes to the big teams in Italy, but maybe everything doesn't click for Roma. It can always implode with Mourinho. Napoli are going to take a step back. There is an opportunity here for Lazio to claim that fourth spot. And then the other team I'm really, really curious about is Atalanta. Atalanta stopped scoring goals last season, and so they fell off the face of the earth, relatively speaking, to what they had been the past couple seasons. They are not changing the way they play. They are going to concede a lot of goals, which means if they don't score boatloads, they are in big trouble. And that is what happened last season. Can they get the train back on the tracks? Because they were qualified for the Champions League when I would argue it was more difficult in terms of 1 through 4 working your way in there. I'm looking at this season saying there is a spot there for the taking. Can they get to the level of, say, a Roma? Can they get back to anything close to what they have been recently? Really, there's one team I am most interested in Italy. It is Atalanta. And then third, I just wanted to highlight this in terms of some of the most productive players in this league not playing for its top teams. Ciro Immobile won another Golden Boot. Of course, he's at Lazio. He scores 20 to 30 goals a season. Is spectacular. Just you can basically bank it at the beginning of the season. If he stays healthy, that's what he's going to do. So he's arguably your best pure goal scorer in the league. Domenico Berardi, 15 goals, 14 assists. That was his league high, by the way, the 14 assists. Still at Sassuolo. I talked about how fun they are to watch, and that yes, they're going to rebuild a little bit, but they didn't lose all their attack. And the player with the most goal involvements per 90 minutes last season, that was Luis Muriel at Atalanta. It is just kind of fascinating because you look at this and, okay, Lautaro Martinez had a big season for Inter, in large part because Lukaku wasn't there anymore. But you're going to expect one of those Inter strikers to be right up there at the top of the league statistically this season. But that AC Milan team, interchangeable pieces at striker, goals from all over the place. Maybe Vlahovic becomes that guy for Juventus, but it was just sort of a weird season where you didn't have the top statistical players. You look at the Premier League, and who is it? It's Kane, it's Son, it's De Bruyne, it's Lewandowski in the Bundesliga, it's Karim Benzema in La Liga. But it just seems like Serie A, there are some stars who, and Lorenzo Insigne is a perfect example of this too. Of course, he's been on some really good Napoli teams, but he never moved to Juventus. He never moved to one of the Milan clubs. There are just these guys who stick around at clubs, it seems like, longer than they should in terms of the talent level they have and the production they're giving you. And so we're going to get to and I'm bad about this too, of just turning on a random Serie A game. But you can find some of the most productive, most talented players in the league without watching AC Milan, Inter, Juventus. Napoli's going to have to find some different players to produce this season. So it's one of the things that sets Serie A apart for me. So I wanted to highlight it real quickly as one of our storylines. Okay, on to Ligue 1. And full disclosure, there's going to be no discussion about who wins the league here. We're going to do things a little bit differently with just the gap between PSG and everybody else. First, though, our summer recap. Speaking of PSG, your two notable signings, Vitinha from Porto, Nordi Mukiele from Leipzig. Those are the two guys that have come through to Paris so far. Couple departures to note real quickly. Monaco, of course, losing Aurelien Tchouameni to Real Madrid, and Chik Decore going from Lens to Crystal Palace. Now, there are other developments and transfers I want to talk about. We're going to save them for a specific storyline here, so we're going to jump right into the storylines, and we'll come back a little bit to transfers at the end. First storyline, Lyon, and to a certain extent, Marseille and Monaco as well. Lyon went from winning the league to 10th place. Lyon went from finishing 4th to finishing 8th. Marseille and Monaco were the two teams that then capitalized and got up there behind PSG. Lyon have done some very, very interesting things in the transfer window we're going to touch on in a minute. I fully expect them to be competing for second place. The whole Lille thing is just absolutely fascinating. That league title just came out of nowhere. And then you have to go play in the Champions League. And again, team without depth playing in Europe, you pay a price for that. Are they able to sort of regroup and benefit from the fact that they don't have those responsibilities now and focus on the league and get themselves back into the Champions League? Marseille were perhaps the biggest winners in all of Europe last year, outside of Real Madrid. Where they were with fans storming the training ground to finishing second, having a good run in Europe, things are in a much, much better place there. And Monaco are just sort of very quietly solid again after a little bit of a rough patch there. So really the larger storyline is who finishes behind PSG, what does that order look like? But more specifically, it's can Lyon bounce back and make that discussion interesting? Second, didn't spend much time on Christophe Galtier when he got the PSG job, so I'm going to talk about him here. Massive, massive fan of this hire. Here's why. PSG tried to go from big name to big name to big name, and it didn't work. Instead of going to another big name in Zinedine Zidane, they chose to do something different. I give them an immense amount of credit for that. It would have been easy to just get the highest profile manager out there you could. But now you have a guy who has excelled in all of the little things and the process and elevating players. Everywhere he goes, his teams just get better, and they get better quickly. See, Lille. And he knows this league inside and out, so if PSG is ever going to just obliterate the rest of the league, he's probably the guy to do it. Of course, this hire is about Champions League. Ligue 1 is a secondary concern and only gets discussed when they're not winning it. I get that. But there is value from that standpoint too if he knows all these teams. He's never had a job like this. And to me, that's exactly the kind of manager PSG needs. He's going to work with people. I just find it hard to believe he's going to have the same kind of tension Thomas Tuchel and Mauricio Pochettino had. And there does seem to be an acknowledgement within PSG they have to approach this differently. Very rarely do you see a team of PSG's resources and financial might acknowledge that throwing money at the problem is not going to fix it. There is a reason they have not been more successful in the Champions League. I really thought they had sort of turned a corner, and to a certain extent they did, but then they went backwards again last season. I am all about this hire. You've got very little to lose because you're going to win the league anyway. So why not go sort of in the complete opposite direction of what you've been doing recently? Now, the one counter argument I will provide is my thing when Pochettino got hired is he also made his living elevating players and getting the most out of teams and sort of getting them to overperform. He had never dealt with the big names and how to manage those egos and all that stuff. And of course, Galtier hasn't either. But if you're going to get two managers run out of town, the caliber of Pochettino and Galtier, because they don't know how to manage, because they can't get it to work with players, you got bigger problems on your hand than whoever your manager is. I'm a huge, huge fan of this, and I think it's going to work better than people even expect. We're not going to see it in Ligue 1. But to me, this is a home run and a sign that PSG have the self-awareness to realize they can't keep following the same formula because it's not working. We're going to try a different equation. And finally, here's where we're going to go back to the transfer window. This league has quickly accumulated a incredible collection of just kind of random bigger name players playing at clubs other than PSG, where you go watch them if they're playing in Europa League or whatever, and you go, oh, here are just some of the examples. Takumi Minamino, Breel Mbolo. Of course, Takumi Minamino coming from Liverpool, Breel Mbolo coming from Borussia Mönchengladbach, Champions League experience, plenty of European experience. Both at Monaco now. After Monaco had a very good season, bringing in two big-time attacking pieces. Joe Rodon is on loan at Rennes. Just throwing that one out there for Spurs fans. Then your most bizarre transfer of the summer, any league. Kasper Schmeichel joined Nice. He will be teammates there with Aaron Ramsey. Adam Buska from the New England Revolution and Brice Samba, who was Nottingham Forest goalkeeper, are both at Lens. And then we get to the Lyon portion of this. Nicolas Tagliafico, Corentin Tolisso, and Alexander Lacazette. That's, Arsenal's captain, a longtime Ajax player, and a valuable member for a while of Bayern Munich. This is why I'm really high on Lyon and think they're going to be the second best team in the league. And then one more to throw in there. Moussa Sissoko is now playing for Nantes. It just kind of conglomerated real quickly, and what got me thinking about this was the Schmeichel transfer. I'm just perplexed. Wish all the best to him. I don't get it. Obviously, more power to you. Do whatever makes you happy. I'm just confused as to why. But then I started going down the list and I went, this is very quickly becoming a fascinating league in terms of just random players who are here. So that is the list I came up with of sort of bigger names, whether you know them from from Premier League or Nicolas Tagliafico being at Ajax for so long, Adam Busca in MLS, all playing in Ligue 1. So if you're looking for a reason to tune in other than PSG, or a reason to tune in knowing PSG is probably going to dominate, hopefully that gives one to you. You get to see some familiar faces playing around the league at teams not named PSG. That is all for our Ligue 1 preview. We're going to take one more break, and when we come back real quickly, weekend look ahead as always. It is here. We have Premier League games to talk about. We have Bundesliga games to talk about. It is finally time. You're watching the Touchline Talk Show. Don't go anywhere. And welcome back to the Touchline Talk Show one final time. We're going to jump right into the weekend look ahead. Like I said before, we actually have European League games in the major leagues to talk about. Some of your better ones from Premier League opening weekend. Season begins Arsenal at Crystal Palace on Friday. Like I said, Crystal Palace was potentially the most underperforming team in the league last season. Patrick Vieira did I would argue, a better job even than he's getting credit for, and he got plenty of credit, deservingly so. And Arsenal make an early statement. Are you here to go make another run at the Champions League? You got some new pieces. What do they look like? I really like this matchup as the curtain raiser. See, you're not getting the City Liverpool on opening weekend. But I think this is going to tell us a lot about these two teams. There's plenty of intrigue for me here. I'm a huge fan of this being our first game of the Premier League season. Then some of your notable games Saturday. Liverpool at Fulham. Welcome back. Fulham, Mitrovic, Craven Cottage, the whole thing. Liverpool going there. Nottingham Forest at Newcastle. This might be the game I am most excited for. We get our first look at Nottingham Forest. Newcastle, as we talked about, so good at the end of last season. You also have Chelsea at Everton to round out the day Saturday. Another really fascinating matchup. Two teams just really not sure what to expect this season. And then Sunday, Brighton at Manchester United. The Eric Ten Hag era officially gets underway. And Manchester City at West Ham. Poor West Ham. They get Manchester City to end the season. They get Manchester City to start the season. Can they avenge that loss? We will see. But that is your biggest games on Premier League opening weekend. Bundesliga also gets underway this weekend, starting with Bayern Munich, Eintracht Frankfurt on Friday. Bayern on the road against the Europa League champions. Really good early season test there. Also a good test for Dortmund. They host Bayer Leverkusen on Saturday. And then also Red Bull Leipzig, Stuttgart on Sunday. Those are most of your top teams. France getting underway as well. PSG playing Clermont on Saturday. there weren't any other particularly inspiring matchups this weekend I wanted to highlight, so we're just going to mention PSG Game 1. And then Major League Soccer and the NWSL real quickly. 2 games, Major League Soccer, I want to highlight Toronto at Nashville. The push for the playoffs continues for Toronto. Nashville, incredibly difficult place to play. That's going to be a really good one. And then LAFC at RSL, 2 of the best teams in the Western Conference. LAFC just continue rolling. Can they keep it up? Still trying to figure out exactly how sold I am on RSL as a legit threat in the playoffs. This good piece of data to draw a better conclusion there. And then the NWSL, your game of the weekend. Houston Dash at OL Reign. 3 versus 4 in the standings as they sit right now. That is all we have for today. Enjoy all of the soccer, domestic, European, this weekend. We will be back Monday to talk about all of it. We will see you then, and take care. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll be back. Weekend Roundup. Premier League games to talk about on Monday.